Kwang felt terrible. He'd thought he'd known what to expect when he agreed to pilot the mission to Baal, but the reality was far more oppressive and unpleasant than anything he imagined. Hell, the contract looked so appealing. Simple task: to pilot the Bester Foundation's expedition ship, the Lincoln Powell, to the Astarte system and into low orbit around the fourth planet, the gas giant Baal, where the ship's scientific crew, 2 scientists, would do their hard-to-understand research and experiments. Kwang was offered this contract because he had already worked on 2 expeditions to study the biosphere of gas giants. There was nothing special about such expeditions. You hang out in the upper atmosphere of the hydrogen-methane colossus and listen to the various wows of biologists about the amazing specimen. Each of those specimens was usually several times the size of the expedition ship, so all research was reduced to observations from a great distance. To Kwang, all this marvelous fauna looked like a collection of giant shapeless jellyfish, not remarkably different from each other. The research ships could not descend deep into the atmosphere, even using the most modern gravitational compensators. The monstrous gravity of the gas giants was still an insurmountable obstacle. A couple months of lazy drifting under the bustle of scientists and a hefty paycheck at the end of the expedition. A win-win. Except this time, the scientists were mentalists, espers, telepaths, goddamn brainiacs. Kwang grimaced, picking at his dinner with his fork. The galley's food processor cooked perfectly for a machine. One of the mentalists, Dr. Louis Pilecki, had a convenient hobby. He collected programs for food processors and even wrote them. Apparently, the honored doctor of exopsychology was fond of tasty food, but on diplomatic missions to chloro-breathing amphibians, one could not count on lavish banquets. Kwang couldn't help but admit that Dr. Pilecki was good at squeezing as much as possible from a standard food processor, but he still had no appetite. The thing was, Kwang hated mentalists. He could bear crossing paths with them in crowded university classrooms or public lectures, but to be trapped in the confined space of a spaceship with 2 brainiacs. Even worse, those 2 were of a special kind. Dr. Pilecki and his colleague, Dr. Terje Latola, were unique in their own way. Regular mentalists were able to receive the mental echoes of people around them, but those 2 were so advanced that they could actively get inside the skull, even if only partially, of strangers. Come on, how can an ordinary person feel at ease knowing that at any moment his thoughts could be eavesdropped on? The fact that the 2 scientists didn't fall into the typical stereotype of the sneaky mentalist didn't make things any better. Luis, a native of the orbital city of Ganymede Delta, was, like all orbitals, tall, thin, dark-skinned, and dark-haired, and most importantly, had the most charming and infectious smile imaginable. As for Terje, even though Dr. Latola was already in her 50s, Kwang was ready to believe that she didn't need to use 1/100th of her rare talent to impress men. A gorgeous blonde with bright blue eyes and a stunning figure, she was a true Valkyrie. Kwang knew that Finns, strictly speaking, were not Scandinavian, but what the hell did it matter? It just wasn't fair. He was stuck on the same ship with 2 mutants who could pick your brains and yet found that they were both the nicest people you'd ever met. Kwang hid from them all over the ship, learning idiotic counting rhymes and performing complex mathematical operations in his mind every time he met one of the mentalists in person, while realizing that he was acting like an idiot. But he couldn't help it. At least it was getting easier. As soon as the ship had entered Baal's upper atmosphere, the 2 mentalists had taken up residence in their lab, leaving only every other day to eat and sleep. Though they'd been sympathetic to Kwang's feelings before, Terje even lectured him on how mentalists had a rigorous code about reading other people's thoughts. It was considered not only a morally wrong deed, but even a crime. And the punishment for it was severe, up to a lifetime exile to a secluded station in the deepest corner of the galaxy. She also said that you can't get into someone else's head involuntarily. It's more like reading a letter. First, you must open the mail and learn the language. After returning to the ship bridge, Kwang turned on the large view screen. The cabin was immediately filled with iridescent splashes of all shades of lilac, purple, and pink from the methane ammonia cloud streaked with the light of Ishtar, the system's sun. No sailbearers could be seen, but Kwang knew that these giant jellyfish-like creatures were somewhere nearby. They always stayed out of direct line of sight, though how would they have any idea of the line of sight of optics-enhanced human vision? Still, for the entire 3 weeks that the expedition had spent in the upper atmosphere of Baal, there were always a few sailbearers drifting around the ship. Sailbearers were the main reason and purpose of the expedition. Apart from them, nothing was exciting about the Ishtar system, a mediocre G4 class star, 6 planets, 4 of which were lifeless balls of rock, and 2 were typical gas giants. But for some reason, 20 years ago, it was first explored not by an automatic probe of the cartography service, but by a research ship with a human crew, including, a rare occurrence for those times, a mentalist. The mentalist was weak. He was a crew psychologist, and he was not directly involved in the recon mission, but he insisted that the report must include his statement that while the ship was orbiting the largest of the gas giants in the system, he had noted strange mental bursts that had nothing to do with the background generated by the rest of the crew. Neither planet nor star had names then and were designated only by long indices of letters and numbers. The report was standardly registered upon the expedition's return. It sank safely into the service's database, unnoticed and uninteresting to anyone, like thousands and thousands of other similar reports before and after it. It would have disappeared there. But 3 years ago, something happened. One of the routine mapping expeditions found an abandoned orbital city in low orbit in the gas giant's upper atmosphere. Its age was first estimated at a few 100,000 years, then a few million. And recently, the talks began about tens of millions. As a result, many people suddenly began to show increased interest in old reports, namely, in reports on studies of planetary systems with gas giants. They have plenty of data to search, as gas giants are a standard part of the galaxy. Naturally, almost no one found anything. The fashion began to wane, and along with it, the money. Galactic expeditions were costly. Scientists and military from several civilizations were slowly poking around the Leviathan station, and the few remaining enthusiasts were poring over the data in circles, hoping to find some clue. But now, the Bester Foundation, the organization with a ridiculous amount of money, thought they found a clue. A dissenting opinion of a mentalist psychologist in a report on the system of an unnamed star. The Foundation gave the star the ancient name Astarte, and the gas giant received the name Baal. Funding had been allocated. An old recon ship, immediately renamed Lincoln Powell, had been purchased, and Kwang had been hired as a pilot. And now Kwang is stuck in this old, rusty bucket in the atmosphere of a gas giant in the company of 2 mutants capable of X-raying his brain down to the very bottom. He glanced involuntarily toward the forward cabin, transformed by the mentalists into the laboratory. When it came to selecting expedition members, Luis and Terje were a natural choice. They were leading experts on contacts with other intelligent species. Who else but them to study a potential new sentient race? It was a fundamentally new experience, because until now, the peculiar fauna of the gas giants was known in many systems, but even the hints of intelligent life there were out of the question. The inhabitants of methane and hydrogen atmospheres were no smarter than Ciliates. No mental outbursts were expected from them. On Baal, however, things turned out differently. The mentalists had not yet been able to establish contact with the sailbearers, but they were absolutely convinced that the creatures drifting slowly through Baal's atmosphere were constantly exchanging complex mentograms. It was astonishing. Kwang remembered the enthusiasm with which Luis had told him of this discovery. The scientist had even managed to infect the pilot with joy and distract him from his constant efforts to erect a mental block of integral and differential equations. "It's absolutely incredible," Luis said with shining eyes. He was sitting in an uncomfortable position on the very edge of the couch, and it looked like he was about to slide to the floor, but the mentalist didn't care. He only cared about one thing: Baal's sailbearers. Such a unique case. Until now, no intelligent species has been known to have not created a material culture, but the sailbearers simply cannot have a material culture for obvious reasons, and yet they exchange highly complex mental signals. "Maybe it's just that we haven't found their city yet?" Kwang asked. "Maybe it's drifting somewhere in the atmosphere where we can't see it, like that station on Leviathan." Louis shook his head. No, that can't be. You've seen the sailbearers. Think about it. How can they create objects of material culture, and most importantly, from what?" Kwang was forced to agree. Baal's sailbearers were not named for nothing. They looked like gigantic, several hundred meters long, oval jellyfish to which someone had attached huge sails from several sides. The sailbearers could unfurl and fold these wing sails that were part of their bodies, changing speed and direction on a fantastic scale. Louis said that sailbearers could reach speeds of several hundred miles per hour, but their natural habitat was the gas giant's upper atmosphere, which contained nothing but gas. What the sailbearers fed on was still a mystery, let alone the construction materials. "We have a theory," Louis said, "that sailbearers didn't evolve naturally." "What do you mean? They're not alive or something?" Louis laughed. "No, of course they are. We think someone helped them. Someone did a lot of work, selection, genetic engineering and such things to help them become the sailbearers we know." Kwang pondered for a moment. "Sounds reasonable," he finally said. "Not that I'm much of an evolutionary biologist, but even I can see that a gas giant's atmosphere is unlikely to produce intelligent life forms. But who would want that? I mean, it's an exceptionally complex and massive task, am I right, Doc? Could it be the ones from Leviathan?" Louis squinted slyly and looked straight into Kwang's eyes. "That's a good question, but I have a much more interesting one. Why would they do that?" Kwang's recollection was interrupted by an alarm buzzer. He pressed a key, unfolding the hollow projection of the ship's systems diagnostic. All readings were normal, except for a slight imbalance in the gravitational compensators. Nothing serious, though, some fraction of a percent. He didn't even feel it on him. Kwang ran a controller subroutine to correct the discrepancy and suddenly felt an unusual, persistent anxiety unrelated to his usual uneasy feeling over the presence of mentalists on the ship. Strange. Kwang was an experienced pilot and used to trusting his intuition. As a rule, it merely represented the first signals of a realization that the logical thinking part of his mind would soon have to come to. Kwang ran through the ship's systems readouts one more time. Here. The power consumption of the forward deckhouse equipment was skyrocketing. For the past week, the scientists had been installing a device they had high hopes for. As far as Kwang understood, it was some sort of mental energy amplifier, a telepathic loudspeaker, with which the mentalists wanted to try to make contact with the sailbearers. But he'd asked them to let him know when they planned to conduct the first tests of the amplifier. Kwang pressed the call button. "Dr. Pilecki, Dr. Latola, what's going on over there?" he said into the microphone of the intercom system. "Have you started the amplifier tests? I can see a huge increase in your lab's power consumption. There was no response. Kwang listened. Some indistinct sounds came from the speaker. Rustling, a low humming, something that sounded like heavy, hoarse breathing. Kwang tried to turn on the surveillance cameras, but the screen remained dark. The cameras were off. Damn scientists and their mania for privacy, he thought, feeling his anxiety rising. Louis, are you all right? Still the same incomprehensible noise. Then, after about 15 seconds, which seemed interminable to Kwang, there was a calm, cold, female voice. Major Kwang, you must come to the forward cabin immediately. We need your help. I repeat, immediately, Terje Latola said, and the connection clicked off. Kwang tried several times to call the scientists, but to no avail. After pondering for half a minute, he stood up and pulled a weapon harness from the captain's safe. He was a little confused at first, as he never used it before apart from drills, but he finally adjusted the straps and snapped the buckles. Kwang drew the blaster from its holster, checked the charge meter, it was full, and went to the forward deck house. Even with an impressive plaster patch on his forehead, covering a dark bruise spreading in all directions, Louis Pilecki still looked cheerful and lively. His smile through his swollen, broken lips still shone with benevolence, which was doubly surprising since it was Kwang who had bestowed these dubious adornments on the mentalist. "But how did you guess?" Louis asked, wincing slightly at the pain in his lips. "You figured it out right away, didn't you?" Kwang shrugged. His left arm was itchy under the layer of bio-gel in the healing sleeve, but that was okay. The fracture would heal in 5 days, and then he could scratch. "Dr. Latola." Terje addressed me by rank. It's been 3 months since the start of the mission, and she's never called me anything but sweet buddy, my dear boy, and so on. And then suddenly, Major Kwang, and in a voice that I'd only heard from Colonel Mittel when he'd got our entire third-year academy class arrested for partying. He looked at the regeneration capsule in which the woman lay. "Honestly, I'm sorry about that. I had no choice. After you hit me with that pipe and broke my arm, I wouldn't have been able to handle both of you. Besides, I was afraid you'd influence me, control me." Louis averted his eyes in embarrassment. "God, I'm so sorry about that, especially since I don't even remember anything. As for Terje, she will be fine. According to the cybermed, your shot didn't hit any vital organs, so all she needs is time and rest. Cybermed plans to wake her up in a week. As for your fears," Louis looked up at Kwang, "you were worried for nothing. Mentalists aren't capable of compelling anyone. We're passive listeners. No matter what rumors spread about us, we can transmit a mentogram under certain conditions. But that's not an order or something like that. No more than a radio broadcast." Kwang shuddered. "I'm not sure about anything after what happened on Baal," he said. "Though I'll be damned if I know exactly what happened there, and how we got out." Louis sighed. "As far as I'm concerned, we owe our rescue solely to you," he said. "If we'd had a mentalist as a pilot, as some of the Science Council members insisted, we wouldn't have had a chance. You saw what happened to me and Terje." "What was it, Doc? Did the sailbearers decide to eat us? Because of your amplifier? You fired your thoughts at them, and they found them too tasty?" Louis shook his head. "I'm afraid the sailbearers had nothing to do with it." Kwang looked at the mentalist in amazement. "What do you mean? I saw them chasing us. When I took the ship out of the atmosphere, there were tens, or maybe even hundreds of thousands of them, and they were somehow affecting the ship's equipment, especially the gravity compensators. At one point, I thought we were done." "You've got it all wrong," Louis said. "The sailbearers weren't chasing us. They were protecting us, and they weren't the ones affecting the equipment. Kwang's jaw dropped. Louis smiled again. Those damn orbitals are such charming people, Kwang thought, even though every other one of them is a mentalist. We were right, Louis said. Sailbearers are indeed artificial beings. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to understand their way of life, how they eat, reproduce, and how long they live. But we had some information about the purpose of their creation after what happened. Did they tell you that? Louis winked at Kwang. You still don't trust mentalists? Please don't feel bad. It's a normal reaction. No, the sailbearers didn't tell us anything. They are not, strictly speaking, adapted for that. Louis looked at the confused Kwang and sighed. Well, let me tell you everything. And you can ask me along the way if you don't understand, okay? Kwang nodded. So, Louis began, the essence of our experiment was to send an amplified mental package to a cluster of sailbearers to draw attention. We assumed that they were an intelligent race in their own right, even if created by someone else, and that they didn't realize that we were intelligent because our mental impulses were too weak by their standards. So it's only an assumption. Kwang felt that he's losing the point. I don't get it, Doc. Are they intelligent or not? I'm confused by your riddles. Patience, my friend. Louis smiled. Are sailbearers intelligent? Yes and no. By our standards, probably not. Tell me, do you consider Powell's central computer intelligent? Kwang shrugged. No, of course not, he said. Artificial intelligence is too expensive and unpredictable to equip a mediocre research ship with it. But it behaves almost like a living thing at times, talking, asking questions, and even adding emotional nuances to its speech, doesn't it? Kwang shrugged again. It's just a little programming. Jesus, Doc, even school children know that. You can't cram a real AI into a processor that's too weak. It's like, I don't know, well, like you can't cram a mind into a snail's brain, if it has a brain at all. But sailbearers got to have big brains, enough for 1,000 people, if not more. Louis sighed again. I'm sorry. My analogy took you in the wrong direction. I meant that sailbearers are no smarter than a computer with good software, because they are machines, or rather artificially designed and programmed organisms, created for one purpose. I wish I knew by whom. Perhaps the station on Leviathan will be able to dig up some clues to the answer to that question. Kwang looked at the mentalist in amazement for a while. And what is the purpose of this? To protect Baal's sleep, of course, Louis answered calmly, from any uninvited guests, and to protect them too, should they show up. Kwang suddenly felt he was taking part in some kind of experiment to discover the limits of man's capacity for surprise. As soon as he thought Louis couldn't say anything more strange, the scientist hit him again. But after Terje had attacked and strangled him, and Louis had tried to break his skull with a piece of pipe, Kwang had given up being surprised to a great extent. For now, at least, things were safe. Sort of. He moved his palm closer to the holster he now always wore on his belt, but caught Louis's gaze and jerked his hand away in embarrassment. The mentalist brushed the awkwardness aside with a careless smile and continued. The thing is, it wasn't the sailbearers that attacked us, me and Terje. We were attacked by Baal himself, and frankly, we were fortunate that he did it almost without waking up like a man who swats away an annoying mosquito. I'm afraid if Baal had really woken up to crush us, nothing would have saved us. There wouldn't have been even a wet spot left from us, along with the sailbearers. As it was, when you took the ship out of the atmosphere, the sailbearers managed to calm him down, and Baal fell back into slumber. Are you saying there is another huge station somewhere on Baal with an ancient sleeping AI that you almost woke up? Kwang asked. Luis laughed and immediately grimaced at the pain in his broken lips. "You've got a hell of a punch," he said. "I wouldn't want to be in the ring against you." "No, that's not what I meant. The sleeping intelligence is Baal himself, the gas giant. He is intelligent and has lived for an unimaginably long time, billions of years. It's hard for me to explain why we're sure, but believe me, it's impossible to lie in a mental package. You can withhold something, but any lie the mentalist will recognize instantly. After Baal's mental blow, thank God the sailbearers managed to weaken it quite a bit. We were overwhelmed with uncontrollable aggression and hatred towards the person who brought us here. The pilot, that is. In human equivalent, Baal's emotions could probably be compared to the thought, "What the hell brought you here, you idiots?" Then the effects of the blow gradually wore off, but the realization of where the blow had come from remained. Kwang slowly digested what he had heard. Having knocked out both mentalists in the forward deckhouse, he switched on the view screen and saw an incredible cluster of sailbearers tumbling between the ship and the depths of Baal's atmosphere. He didn't think long, but simply fired up the thrusters and raced away from Baal's atmosphere and out of the Astarte system. Suddenly, a thought occurred to him. "Doc, tell me, why didn't I feel anything?" he asked. "You've been driven mad by Baal, but I was in my senses. Am I insensitive to such blows?" "I don't know exactly, but you probably shouldn't take credit for that," Luis said. "I think Baal just didn't notice you. We poked him with a needle of our own amplified mental impulses, and you were like that sly mosquito that sits quietly on the wall while its squeaky friends are chased away with a rolled-up newspaper." Kwang smiled. "Well, we'll be home soon," he said encouragingly. "You'll heal, gain strength, and then we'll come back here to study your treasure, the only intelligent planet in the universe. I hope no one wakes him up before then." "You see, there's a problem," Luis said. "We're not going home now. We have to get to the Leviathan system right away. We have to warn the researchers who work there not to do anything, like we did. There are no sailbearers in Leviathan's atmosphere." "Are you saying that Leviathan is also—" Kwang stared at the mentalist. "But how did you— Ah, I see. The same mentagram?" Luis nodded. "Shit," Kwang shuddered. "One intelligent planet makes you uneasy, and then you find out there are two of those." "Not two," Luis said quietly. "I don't want to upset you, but the mentogram flashed with fragments of memories of many such dormant minds." "Many?" Luis looked Kwang straight in the eyes. "Hundreds of millions, at least." There was silence in the cabin. Then Kwang finally sighed and said, "Now you've really scared me, Doc." Luis sighed too. "I wish I could trade fears with you. I know you haven't had time to think about it yet, but think about how they've all been asleep for millions of years." He scratched his forehead thoughtfully. "I'm much more afraid of those who put them all to sleep